Welcome to the Green Room, where we discuss the latest happenings in cannabis. I'm Martin Lane, the co-founder of Cannabiz, and joining me this week is our special guest, Foliumed founder and CEO Oliver Zugel. Oliver, thanks for joining us from sunny Madrid, I believe.
Well, thanks for having me, Martin. How are you doing today?
Not too bad, thank you. I've managed to put some lights on because I've realised that I'm about to be plunged into darkness just as the sun's coming up for you. So hopefully we'll be all good. I wanted to start actually, for those who don't know, can you tell us a little bit about Foliumed and what you guys do?
Yeah, so Foliumed is a medical cannabis producer focused on the phytopharmaceutical space, which is growing on our farm in Colombia and doing primary extraction there. And then the extract is being processed in a German EU GMP pharmaceutical facility into final medical cannabis products.
Okay, and for those who don't know about this, can you explain a little bit about what you mean about phytopharmaceutical?
Yeah, it's jargon. I apologize for this. Very simple. In Greek, phyton is plant and pharmakon means medicine. So fundamentally, we're talking about a plant medicine focus. And the reason I'm describing this way is, on the one hand, you have your cannabis being either a pharmaceutical product, strictly speaking, this is what GW Pharma does, or on the other hand, you're a completely unregulated product, which is what we're seeing with CBD markets in most of the Anglo-Saxon geographies. The phytopharmaceutical space fundamentally is when you are manufacturing the cannabis under GMP condition, replicatable, standardized. You use extracts so you get to relatively high concentrations and you are applying medical science to prove the efficacy. This is kind of the spot in which we are competing.
Right, thank you. And I was looking at your LinkedIn profile recently, and you've had a long corporate career in a number of different sectors, including I think running a multinational publicly listed gambling business. What do you think cannabis can kind of learn from other heavily regulated industries, if anything?
Yeah, well, first of all, I have been in regulated industry for most of my life, and in cannabis really only for 5 years. My first cannabis venture was in the United States, and Foliumed is the second company I've built and run. I think what I've learned spending a long time now in regulated businesses is that, first of all, the time frames for development are long. And that very often is misunderstood also by many investors or the early investors into the medical cannabis space. Because fundamentally, I think the regulatory pathway for medical cannabis isn't yet fully defined. I think regulators have made a tremendously good effort in most markets by now to bring them medicine to patients without marketing authorization, so without the traditional pharmaceutical route. But at this point in time, really the verdict is still out of whether your medical cannabis how that ultimately will be regulated. The special access schemes by definition have a transitory nature. And therefore, I think it is the future on where we, from a regulatory perspective, land up, I think is still pretty unclear. So I think when you're operating in a space like this and when you're dealing with a narcotics product, I think you do need to arm yourself with patience, first and foremost.
And that's patience with an ENCE rather than an IENTS, I guess, but you probably need both ultimately. It's interesting. You mentioned you built a cannabis business in the US. You're now building Foliumed. When you talk about kind of regulation and the different kind of ways that countries are going about it, where do you see examples of it going wrong? To start with a negative.
Yeah, look, I think as usual, as in life, things which are operating at extremes typically tend to be a little more complicated. I would argue that the adult use regulation in many of the US states is ultra liberal, and I do not believe that in the long term will be sustainable. We will see public health effects we will see over time, negative consequences of giving access on an unlimited dose basis to very highly concentrated, recreational product. I don't. So in the US, again, I think the economic interests there of the industry have led us this way. This is the big business. This is where the volume is, of course. But I think it's ultimately will be shown in my mind that probably there is going to be some form of a rollback in terms of the liberal approach, which currently is being taken in the same way as what happened with tobacco and with alcohol ultimately. So I think that regulation will over time change. On the other hand, on the other extreme, you have also the CBD regulation in the US, which strikes me as not being much of a regulation at all. And it cannot be that I think products can be marketed with health benefits, which are not even manufactured to the standard you would expect from a vitamin C or omega-3. That just cannot be the case. So these are, I think, for me, two regulations at the fringe, which I think are not conducive to get to a good outcome.
And just to sort of bring things, into Australia for a sec, obviously very different here. It's, very much a medical market. How do you see the Australian sort of regulatory pathway and what's your kind of view on that?
Yeah, we have been active in Australia now for some while, and we're very encouraged by the regulation we see there, because I think it's an intelligent middle pathway. So the regulations were set into place. You have provided access to patients, and the patients' numbers have been growing a lot because of this. And at the same time, now we have seen that the scheduling, for an OTC product under Schedule 3. I think what we are seeing in Australia is that it's an intelligent approach which recognizes, on the one hand, that medical cannabis isn't a synthetic pharmaceutical drug, and therefore cannot be pressed under a RCT clinical trial scheme with 10-year development periods. And at the same time, I think I've also recognized that the US path to CBD, which is fundamentally being unregulated, is also not sensible, and have required for the over-the-counter product meaningful drug development to take place, and efficacy and your clinical trials in a more reduced format. I think that's in our mind a pretty intelligent way of finding a middle path here.
Now, rather typically, I've run into some technical problems because it appears my microphone went off. So I just want to make sure. Can you still hear me?
I can still hear you.
Good.
Yes,
and we'll go with Plan B, which is the laptop mic. So hopefully we'll be uninterrupted from here onwards. Interesting what you say, and that kind of I think obviously presents a lot of potential opportunities for the cannabis industry in Australia in the next few years. How do you see it planning out from here with the regulatory kind of changes that we've kind of seen in the last sort of 6 to 12 months?
Well, first of all, as I said, I think the market in Australia has evolved very positively, in a very short period of time, and particularly also if you compare it with Germany, which is starting to go sideways a little over the last 12 to 18 months, I would say. So you have seen, a rapid increase in patient numbers, in the amount of prescriptions which are being written, etc. But if you look at the broader scheme of things, as of 2021, we probably have 50,000 patients and $150 million market. That's minuscule when you compare that to the market for complementary medicines. What do I mean by complementary medicines? It's either herbal preparation, herbal medicines, or nutritional supplements. That's a market which in Australia is $4.5 billion. That's 30 times the size of what we're looking at in medical cannabis. I think you have over 10 million regular users for complementary medicine, as opposed to the 50,000 patients we have right now. So I think we think that the opportunity sits in when medical cannabis transitions out of a niche box which affects a relatively small number of patients with very high economic spending capacity, we'll come back to that, towards a mass market approach where people can access the product without a prescription, recommended by the pharmacists. I think that will be a game changer for the industry as far as we can tell.
Yeah, that's fascinating, because so you would see that as kind of the big opportunity here, rather than kind of medicinal cannabis users migrating from the black market to over-the-counter medicines.
Yes, I think what you can see from the US now is that the black market will massively fuel the growth when you have a liberal adult use regulation. So I think then indeed, what provides the fuel for the market growth mostly is people to drop their supply from the dealer for something which is better marketed, which is more consistent, which they can access in a legal way at a decent price. I think that transition from black market into medical, I think is not that pronounced. And I would rather think that what we will be seeing by the time the S3, the over-the-counter product is well established, that the real source of volume and interest will come from people who today already are users of herbal medicines, and are complementary medicine users, and there are a lot of them around.
Yeah, interesting. I mean, as you say, the numbers you're kind of quoting there, that's still quite a kind of potential gold rush for the companies that get it right. What kind of boxes will the winners kind of going to have to tick in your view to kind of make the most of that opportunity?
It's a long list, and I think very hard to tick off for anyone on their own. And let's start. I think the biggest challenge of all of them is that you will need to produce a product which provides a monthly dose, say, in the 50, 60 or 70 Australian dollar range. And that is today, under today's economics, if you are growing and cultivating in the Northern Hemisphere or in Australia, it's not possible. I mean, the only way if you would get to that is by providing very low dosage products, which is what we're seeing in the CBD market in the US. So you can buy yourself a bottle with 300 milligrams, but that's not a monthly dose, and it will not be able to prove any efficacy for that. So that's, I think, the economics of cannabis today when you cultivate it under the conditions you have in Australia or the Northern Hemisphere are challenging. That's probably the biggest box, but there are many others. Secondly, that you need to generate some form of intellectual property. So it's worth your while going through a 2-year drug development program. If you do not have that, then it becomes quite expensive. You have to do another tincture. I think in my mind, the third box is I also cannot see that a S3 medicine will be presented in a tincture format. We have no other complementary medicines which are presented in this way. So I think you need to move towards more innovative delivery forms. Again, soft gels, which is what we're doing, is not particularly innovative in the complementary medicine space, but in the cannabis space, it's still really a very small part of the market, if you think about that. And finally, you do need to have a brand and distribution. And none of the medical cannabis players at this point in time really have the size or the marketing muscle behind them, which you need when you're starting to play in complementary medicines. There it really matters. You're starting to approach 20,000 pharmacies, and the brand and distribution power is really important.
Yeah, interesting what you say about price, because I think one of the problems highlighted in the latest Fresh Leaf Analytics report was exactly what you said, the average unit price of products which currently fit the product profile for Schedule 3 kind of low dose CBD as outlined, by the TGA. It's $193, and as you say, that's a lot more than your average herbal medicine, isn't it? Yeah,
look, at the average spend of herbal medicine buyers, complementary medicine, will be in the order of $30, $40 per month. And I think if you try to sell to them a $200 products are going to work. So I think what you will be seeing that to really have mass market acceptance, product needs to be priced in what I said before, $50, $60, $70 maximum for the monthly dose. And if you cannot reach that, I don't think there will be a big adoption come coming from the complementary medicine users. You still will attract people who are currently buying your extracts under the Schedule 4 of your special access scheme regulations, but that's a small number. So I think this is the major challenge we see, and where we see the opportunity for ourselves, given that our cost of manufacturing in Colombia are a fraction of what it takes to do that in the Northern Hemisphere.
Yeah, I was going to ask you about that, because obviously, so size of the prize, potentially large, but clearly some challenges as you've outlined. Yeah, what role do you see Foliumed as sort of playing in that space? Well, yeah, as I said, the list of boxes to tick to win in the phytopharmaceutical space, as I call it, so the over-the-counter play, is too long for anyone, I think, to do on their own. Secondly, we're still a relatively young company, and we're foreigners in the space in Australia. And so therefore, I think for us, it's pretty clear that we want to team up with a local player who can add to what we bring, which is low-cost supply, GMP manufacturing, expertise in drug development, can bring the local expertise of working with a regulator, has the distribution power, and has a brand. So that's, I think, the going it alone option, I think, is a bit hard for us to invest. It's not the pathway I think we're embarking on. But we think that we tick some of these boxes. So and I think that should allow us, in partnership with a local player, to make meaningful headway. And sorry, did you say you have a partner signed up? We are still evaluating our options with partners, and I cannot tell you who those are, but fundamentally, in principle, what they're bringing to the table is local regulatory insights and expertise, distribution power, and some form of brand recognition with the existing SAS users, so with the existing medical cannabis patient community. So yeah, okay, that feels like quite a scoop. You can just tell me. We won't tell anybody else. No, I cannot. So just so I'm clear, I just want to make sure I've kind of understand the business model. So you do cultivation in Colombia, manufacturing and drug development in Germany, and then you ship the EU GMP compliant product to your partner or partners in Australia and other markets. Is that kind of how it works? It's correct. And again, given that you had lots of questions recently, amongst your patient group of where the S3 product is in the pharmacies, this is still it's probably 18 months to 2 years away. So there is a long development pathway required, both with regards to providing clinical trial material, which is manufactured under the right standards, designing the clinical study. So I would think that depending on how the clinical trial regulations ultimately come out from the TGA, that you're looking still at 18 months to 24 months before the product lands on a pharmacy shelf on an over-the-counter basis. You've kind of answered my final question, but so I'll adapt it. But usually what I like to do when we get guests on the green room is to get them to do a little bit of crystal ball gazing, and given the rate of change in Australia, it's difficult to kind of project 1 year forward, let alone 5 years forward. But how do you see the kind of market developing in that you've kind of mentioned the 12 to 18 month period, which I think is something that everybody feels is not a crazy kind of time frame. But at what point will medicinal cannabis be part of the complementary medicine industry in this country, do you think? I will not give you a very good answer to this question, but let me try to get as close to it as I can. Well, first of all, if you look at the math, we have a $150 million market right now for medical cannabis, and we have perhaps 30 local producers and another 30 international guys trying to chase it. If you divide 150 by, call it 50, you can see that the average volume for every producer is vastly uneconomical. So
So I think you will see, as in any other market, consolidation setting in, I think at a pretty important scale. And then in my mind, you will have some of these companies emerging into the complementary medicine, the over-the-counter space, but it's not the same business model. So typically when you operate in phytopharmaceuticals, your margins are lower. There's some form of marketing expense to it. The protection of owning a license really no longer is of all that much relevance. So hard to predict, but I think there will be 3, 4, 5 people emerging in the over-the-counter opportunity. And I would think that some of them will be coming from other herbal medicines. So I'd be surprised if as part of the S3 opportunity, the over-the-counter opportunity, you wouldn't have people coming in who are currently either in the vitamin space or they do scientifically backed herbal medicine formulations already. There's a very sizable market for that in Australia. So I think we will see some of that coming. And I think that's a big change for the existing medical cannabis companies. They need, I think we all need to think about how that competitive landscape will shape out over the next couple of years.
Yeah, it's interesting you say that, because I think there was a bit of a thread on LinkedIn recently started by Matt Lammers at MJ Biz, talking about the potential oversupply in Australia, given the size of the medical market currently, and the relative reluctance of other countries to be importers. And I guess the challenge there is that obviously you've got to supply's got to meet demand. I guess what you're saying is that part of the solution to that is that cannabis becomes, as you say, more of a complementary medicine and plays in that space rather than the purely medical space. And
yeah, this is one, and the other one is, of course, if Australia decided to go adult use, which I have no visibility on really at all. I think that's the other rescue anchor, but again with the caveat that if you have built yourself as a medical cannabis company with science, medical advisory boards, etc., to make a transition into a marketing business where you're coming out every month with a new product, with a different color, with a different thing. I think, again, many people underestimate the challenge of making that transition. So that rescue anchor, which I think some people believe will occur, I think is not that, it's not floating you all that well in my mind. If your DNA as a company, is centered around medical cannabis, like is the case there with us, for example.
Yeah, and I guess from a timing point of view, you wouldn't be betting your business model on that happening, anytime soon. Whereas the changes that are in front of us in terms of OTC are there. So that opportunity feels like the one that's certainly going to come sooner than the legalization of recreational cannabis in Australia.
I think so too. And Matt's conclusion with regards to oversupply is probably even underestimating the magnitude of it. I always give people an example. We have a 16-hectare cultivation, which can turn 100 tons of cannabis flower per year. We are only using less than 10% of it right now. I don't expect to use significantly more. But on that 16 hectare, I could produce the entire demand of Germany only 3 times over. So it's, and we're small still. So you have other guys who have 200 hectares and they will do 50 hectares. I think that the oversupply issue is massive, really, in the industry. And well, let's see how that's going to play out.
We will indeed. Well, Oliver, I'm going to leave it there and let you get on with the rest of your day. Thanks for chatting. It's always good to catch up, and we'll no doubt talk again very soon.
Super. Thanks for having me there. Be well, Martin.
You too. Cheers.